The photo trembled in weathered hands as Leonardo DiCaprio stopped mid-sentence about climate change. Ellen had been discussing the actor's environmental foundation when she noticed the elderly man in the second row clutching what looked like a faded family portrait, tears streaming down his face. What happened next proved that sometimes the fight to save the planet isn't about statistics or polar ice caps, but about the homes and memories we're already losing to the climate crisis. The Ellen DeGeneres Show studio buzzed with passionate energy this Thursday afternoon in Burbank. 400 audience members filled the space, their attention riveted as one of Hollywood's most committed environmental activists discussed his latest documentary about rising sea levels. Leonardo DiCaprio sat in the guest chair with characteristic intensity, wearing a simple gray sweater that couldn't contain the urgency of his message. Ellen, striking in a navy blue blazer with emerald green accents that seemed to shimmer under the studio lights, was thoroughly engaged as Leo spoke about the devastating impact of climate change on coastal communities worldwide. Leo, your new documentary, The Last Shore, has been getting incredible reviews, Ellen said, leaning forward with the genuine fascination that had made her America's most trusted interviewer. What made you want to focus specifically on families losing their ancestral homes to rising waters? Leo's eyes lit up with the passion that had driven him to become one of the world's foremost celebrity environmentalists. Ellen, we talk about climate change in terms of degrees and carbon emissions, but we rarely talk about it in human terms. What does it mean when a family has lived in the same house for 4 generations, and suddenly the ocean is literally swallowing their front yard? The audience nodded thoughtfully, many beginning to understand that environmental activism wasn't just about saving polar bears, but about protecting communities, cultures, and memories that could never be replaced once they were gone. But Ellen's attention was suddenly captured by movement in the second row. An elderly man, probably in his 70s, was holding what appeared to be an old photograph, his hands shaking as he stared at it with an expression of profound loss. Tears were streaming down his weathered face, and Ellen could see his lips moving as if he were having a conversation with the image in his hands. The worst part, Leo continued, unaware of the personal drama unfolding just feet away, is that these aren't just houses being lost. These are repositories of family history, places where children took their first steps, where grandparents shared stories, where entire family legacies lived. When the water comes, it doesn't just take buildings, it takes everything that made those places home. The elderly man's tears increased as Leo spoke, and Ellen realized that whatever was in that photograph was connected to exactly what Leo was describing. Her maternal instincts, finely tuned after decades of connecting with people in crisis, told her this wasn't just emotional reaction to a documentary. This was personal. Ellen stood up abruptly from her chair, her hands pressed to her heart, as she realized she was witnessing something profound. The sudden movement caused a ripple of confusion through the studio, as audience members tried to understand why their host was abandoning her interview. "I'm sorry, Leo," Ellen said, her voice carrying across the studio with unusual gravity. "I need to check on someone." Leo looked puzzled, but immediately understood that something important was happening. He turned in his chair to see where Ellen was looking, and his expression changed when he spotted the crying elderly man clutching the photograph. Ellen walked down the steps toward the audience, but instead of her usual confident stride, she moved with the careful reverence of someone approaching something sacred. The cameras followed her, unsure whether this was planned or completely spontaneous. "Sir?" Ellen said gently as she approached the trembling man. "I can see you're upset. Is there something you'd like to share with us?" The man looked up, startled to realize he had become the center of attention. 74-year-old Carlos Mendez, a retired fisherman from Louisiana, clutched the photograph tighter against his chest, clearly torn between the desire to remain invisible and the need to be heard. "I'm sorry," Carlos whispered, his voice thick with a Louisiana accent and 40 years of grief. "I didn't mean to interrupt. It's just, when he started talking about families losing their homes, I couldn't help thinking about my Maria." Ellen's expression softened completely as she recognized the tone of someone carrying unbearable loss. "Who is Maria, sweetheart?" Carlos held up the photograph with trembling hands. It showed a young woman in a white dress standing in front of a small house surrounded by massive oak trees draped in Spanish moss. Behind her, a calm bayou stretched into the distance, creating a scene of such peaceful beauty that it seemed like something from a fairy tale. "My wife," Carlos said, his voice breaking. "This was taken on our wedding day 52 years ago, in front of our house in Plaquemines Parish. We raised 4 children there, hosted family reunions under those oak trees, watched dozens of grandchildren learn to fish from our dock." Leo had quietly left his chair and was now standing behind Ellen, his face grave as he began to understand what was coming next. "Where is the house now?" Ellen asked, though something in Carlos's expression had already given her the answer. "Gone," Carlos said simply. "All of it. The house, the trees, the dock, everything. Hurricane Katrina took some of it in 2005, but we rebuilt. Then Isaac damaged it again in 2012, and we fixed it again. But the water just kept coming. Every storm, every high tide, every heavy rain season, we lost a little more. Last year, Hurricane Ida finished what the others started." The studio was completely silent as Carlos continued, his words painting a picture of slow-motion devastation that millions of coastal residents were experiencing but rarely talked about. "The worst part wasn't losing the house," Carlos said, his voice gaining strength as he spoke about his pain. "The worst part was watching Maria fight to save it for 20 years after Katrina, spending our retirement savings over and over to rebuild, to repair, to keep our family's history alive. She died of a heart attack 2 years ago, standing in floodwater in our kitchen, trying to save our family photos from another surge." Ellen's hands flew to cover her mouth in horror and disbelief, her eyes wide with the shock of hearing such devastating loss described so quietly, so matter-of-factly, as if this kind of tragedy was just part of life now. Leo stepped forward, his usual celebrity composure completely abandoned as he faced the human cost of the environmental crisis he had spent decades trying to prevent. "Carlos," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I am so deeply sorry for your loss. Maria sounds like she was an incredible woman." "She was everything," Carlos said, looking at Leo with eyes that held both gratitude and unbearable sadness. "She was a teacher for 30 years, taught 3 generations of kids in our parish. She believed that if we just fought hard enough, loved the land enough, took care of what we had, everything would be okay. But the water doesn't care how much you love something." Ellen felt tears streaming down her own face as she realized she was hearing not just one family's tragedy, but the story of countless communities being slowly erased by climate change, while the rest of the world argued about policy and politics. "Carlos," Leo said, his voice steady but emotional, "your Maria was right to fight. She was right to believe that love and care matter. The tragedy isn't that she fought too hard, it's that she had to fight alone." Leo turned to address the entire studio, his passion now directed not toward abstract environmental concepts, but toward the very real human being standing in front of him. "This is why we do the work we do. Not for polar bears, not for coral reefs, not for abstract future generations, but for people like Carlos and Maria, who deserved to grow old in the home they built together." Ellen, wiping her eyes, walked closer to Carlos and gently placed her hand on his shoulder. "Tell us about Maria. What would she want people to know?" Carlos looked down at the photograph again, his weathered fingers tracing the edges worn smooth from decades of handling. She used to say that every time we rebuilt after a storm, every time we planted new flowers in the destroyed garden, every time we invited neighbors back for Sunday dinner in our patched-up dining room, we were voting for hope. She said giving up on our home would be like giving up on the idea that people and places could heal, that love could outlast disasters. His voice grew stronger as he continued sharing Maria's wisdom. When our youngest granddaughter was born 8 years ago, Maria insisted we have the baptism reception at our house, even though half the floor was still warped from the last flood. She spent 3 days cleaning and cooking, making everything beautiful despite the damage. She said that little girl needed to know where she came from, needed to feel connected to her roots, even if those roots were underwater half the time. Carlos paused, looking around the studio as if seeing it for the first time. Maria taught 4th grade for 30 years at Plaquemines Elementary. After Katrina, when they were talking about not reopening the school because too many families had moved away, she started a letter-writing campaign. She convinced the school board that education was what would bring the community back, that children were what gave people a reason to stay and rebuild. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word of this unexpected testament to resilience and love. She was right. That school became the heart of our recovery. Parents moved back specifically so their kids could be in Maria's classroom. She didn't just teach reading and math. She taught them that their community mattered, that their history was worth preserving, that they belonged to something bigger than themselves. She was an incredible teacher, Ellen said, her voice full of admiration for a woman she'd never met. She was teaching you and your whole community that resilience isn't just about bouncing back. It's about believing that some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight seems impossible. Leo nodded emphatically, his hands clasped at his chest in a gesture of deep respect. Carlos, I want to do something. I want to make sure Maria's story becomes part of our documentary. Not as a sad ending, but as an example of the courage and love that we're fighting to protect. But Leo wasn't finished. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. More than that, I want to connect you with our foundation's Gulf Coast Resilience Project. We work with communities like yours to help families transition, to preserve the stories and histories that would otherwise be lost, and to fight for policies that protect the places that can still be saved. Carlos stared at Leo in amazement, clearly overwhelmed by the idea that his personal loss could become part of something larger, something that might help other families avoid what he and Maria had endured. There's something else, Ellen said, her voice gaining strength as an idea formed. Carlos, I want you to tell Maria's story on our show. Not just today, but in a full segment where we can really honor her memory and help people understand what climate change looks like when it's happening to someone you love. Ellen turned to face the camera directly, her navy blazer and emerald accents creating a striking image as she addressed not just her studio audience, but millions of viewers at home. We talk about climate change like it's a future problem, but for families like Carlos and Maria's, it's been a present reality for decades. These are the stories we need to hear, the people we need to fight for. The audience erupted in applause, not the polite television kind, but the deep, sustained recognition of witnessing something authentic and important. People were on their feet, many wiping away their own tears, as they thought about what it would mean to lose not just a house, but a lifetime of memories, a family legacy, a connection to place that could never be recreated. Leo walked over to Carlos, his usual celebrity composure completely abandoned as he processed the magnitude of what he had just heard. This wasn't a statistic from a climate report or a scene from a documentary. This was a real family whose love story had been slowly destroyed by the very environmental crisis he had spent decades trying to prevent. Instead of offering a handshake or a professional pat on the shoulder, Leo pulled the elderly man into a genuine embrace that lasted several seconds. It was the kind of hug that acknowledged shared grief, mutual respect, and a commitment to action that went beyond words or photo opportunities. "Carlos," Leo said, his voice thick with emotion as he stepped back but kept his hands on the older man's shoulders. "Maria sounds like she was not just an incredible wife and teacher, but a true climate hero. She was fighting this battle long before most of us even understood it was a battle." Leo turned to address Ellen and the audience, his passion now directed not toward abstract environmental concepts, but toward the very real human being who had just shared his most painful loss. "This is exactly why we do the work we do. Not for polar ice caps or carbon emission statistics, not for abstract future generations, but for people like Carlos and Maria who deserved to grow old together in the home they built with their own hands, who deserved to watch their grandchildren play under the same oak trees where they fell in love." Leo reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts with purpose. "Carlos, I want to do something concrete right now. I want to connect you with Dr. Sarah Williams, who runs our foundation's Gulf Coast Resilience Project. She works specifically with families like yours, helping them navigate the transition process, preserve family histories that would otherwise be lost, and advocate for policies that protect the communities that can still be saved." Leo handed Carlos his phone so the older man could see the contact information clearly. "Dr. Williams has a team of social workers, legal advocates, and community organizers who understand that climate adaptation isn't just about moving people out of harm's way. It's about helping them carry their stories, their traditions, and their sense of community with them wherever they go." But Leo's voice grew even more determined as he continued. "More than that, I want Maria's story to become a central part of our upcoming documentary series about climate resilience in American communities. Not as a tragedy, but as an example of the incredible courage and love that we're fighting to protect and honor." Ellen joined the embrace, creating a moment of human connection that transcended celebrity, activism, and entertainment, proving that sometimes the most important conversations happen when we stop talking about issues and start listening to people. 6 months later, Carlos Mendez became a featured advocate for the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation's Gulf Coast Resilience Project. His story of love, loss, and determination to honor Maria's memory inspired new funding for climate adaptation programs and helped dozens of vulnerable coastal communities prepare for the challenges ahead. The segment Ellen produced about Carlos and Maria's story became one of the most watched episodes in the show's history, not because of celebrity drama or entertainment value, but because it showed millions of viewers that climate change wasn't an abstract political issue, but a deeply personal human crisis affecting real families with real stories worth protecting. Maria's photograph, the one Carlos had clutched during that emotional taping, was enlarged and displayed in the Foundation's New York headquarters, not as a memorial to loss, but as a reminder of why the fight to protect our planet is ultimately about protecting the places and people we love.